Okay, welcome everyone to the latest edition of the Scholar Gypsies. Once again, we're live streaming, so bear with us. We might have a couple of technical difficulties as we're going. I'm delighted today to have Laoise De Brún. She's a barrister, journalist, and founder of the Countess. The Countess are holding a conference this Saturday in the RDS Concert Hall called "It's Resisting Ideology," and I'm going to get Laoise to tell us a bit about that. So, Laoise, welcome, and thanks for doing this. I know the last couple of days before a big event are manic, and 1,000 different things have to be dealt with. So, I appreciate your time. Maybe just first, if you could tell people who may not be aware of the work of the Countess, what it is you do, why you do it, and maybe lead us into the event and some of the speakers you've lined up for Saturday.
Sure. Well, firstly, thank you so much for having me back again. It's always great to talk to you and your followers and listeners and audience. So I founded the Countess in 2020 to try to solve a problem as I saw it at a grassroots level, to build an organization that would be grassroots and that would tackle this issue. Because what I realized was that whilst the official narrative was that there was a very small number of highly vulnerable and distressed individuals who must have what are now called trans rights and who must be enabled to self-identify. And of course, that was passed into law, or had been made law in 2018 in Ireland, 2015 rather. And so I think what was happening was I could see what was happening in the UK, and I was involved just in online kind of activism there. And then I joined the dots, I suppose you could say. I realised that the impact of gender ideology could be felt throughout all of society, that we were essentially saying that we have two sex classes, male and female, but now, for the first time ever, some men who say they're women are also part of the sex class called women. And that immediately impacts all the rights, protections, freedoms that are attached to that discrete sex class. So that means that a man can then enter a female toilet or play female sport, or in fact be housed in a female prison. So I could see how catastrophic this would be for the rights of women and for child safeguarding. And then, of course, in fact, my entry point was how this impacted lesbians, and they have been the first ones really to be impacted by this because of the incursion into their spaces, and also because young lesbians, in particular butch lesbians, are highly vulnerable to the ideology and are being told by the ideology that they are in fact trans men, or at the very least non-binary. So I kind of scoped quite hard and teased it out and worked out that there was 8 pillars of concern, which are the areas of life that we see as being impacted by this ideology, whether it's by self-ID, gender self-ID, or trans ideology, gender ideology, you can call it whatever, any of those names. And they are the areas of life where sex matters. So things like single-sex spaces, and that would include shelters, rape crisis centres, prisons, obviously, and sport. And then we've got a schools and safeguarding team. That schools would include indoctrination of children via education, and also how this impacts their spaces in schools and changing rooms and toilets. So we really look at this in the round, and we look at it issue by issue. And we've always had really strict social media policies, language policies, and a really very disciplined approach to this from the very start. Like, we will never get personal with anyone. We really don't care about personalities. We are only here to talk about practice, policy, law, legislation. We're here to empower ordinary people. You know, not everyone can sit down and write a perfect letter to the editor of the Sunday papers. So we understand that there's a growing disquiet in this country at a grassroots level, whether that's parents worried about what the children are being taught, or why the girls have lost their girls-only toilets. Will my daughter be tackled by a boy on a football pitch, as the LGFA has decreed can happen if a boy fills out a form? He is allowed to play LGFA after the age of 12. So this is really kind of now permeating Irish society to such an extent. And I do believe that the 1.1 million people who voted it in the manner that they did to bring about the biggest ever defeat of a constitutional amendment that we saw in the referendum. I do think that was a rejection of this ideology. Because certainly the annihilation of motherhood is part of this ideology. And so with that in mind, and also in the wake of the Cass review, which is the biggest ever, most comprehensive independent review of the efficacy or the evidence base, you could say, of gender medicine for young people. And it's been quite damning. And it's beyond dispute now that this is experimental medicine at the very best, really. And not only that, one of the key reasons behind doing this for us, for the women of the Countess, the women and men of the Countess, is that we see so clearly that trans healthcare for young people is really, we're trying to protect vulnerable, quite often autistic, more often than not, 90%, let's say, will turn out to be gay. We're trying to protect gay, often autistic, highly vulnerable, distressed young people from incredibly dangerous, unethical, medicine, so-called medicine without an evidence base. And I think that's why a lot of us have, joined this kind of grassroots global movement, and it is a global movement. Ireland, we're only one part of a huge global resistance to this, and that's why the conference is called Resisting Ideology. It's about giving people the tools. I think it's really, really important as well that we look at the whole tapestry, work out how deep the roots are, where the tendrils are, work out how we got here. A lot of it is systematic in Ireland. It's systemic because there's a lack of rigor at the heart of government. The government ministers are spoon-fed legislation and policy really by NGOs, but also by Europe. So there's a dual problem there with how easy it is to kind of infiltrate ideology into that ecosystem, and that's what we are now experiencing in Ireland. And it's fair to say, and I'm not the only one saying this, that whole swathes of the public sector are captured by this ideology. So our conference is about addressing that, but not just depressing people. Like, we want to empower them. We want this to be transformational, and we want them to go home and think, actually, God, I really understand it, and maybe I was overwhelmed at the beginning of the conference, but I'm not by the end of it. I understand it, and I know how I can tackle this in my own life, because you have to bite things off and make them bite-sized, and I feel like that with regard to our work. That's why we look at it area by area. That's why we have working groups for each section, because it's too overwhelming otherwise, because it is really embedded into the Anglosphere. Trans is mainstream, and what we're trying to do is explore the social, political, clinical phenomenon that is trans.
Yeah. I just noticed, because I remember during last summer you had an event in Buswells, and you had a policy document, on specifically on men being housed in women's prisons, as I recall, and just the apathy that was around the political class. I felt in terms of this was such an obvious problem with an obvious to my mind, solution. And now I know Padder Tubin was there, and Carol Nolan. How have you found the political class to deal with? Is there apathy there? Is there more of an appetite now, especially since we say the referenda in March? Is there momentum coming in your favour, do you think?
I think that had the referendum been the other way, it would have been there would have been kind of a jubilant, triumphalist, possibly deconstruction of what it all meant and how brilliant we were, and a big clap on the back for all of us being such good progressives. I think that it went so badly wrong for them. Obviously, no one runs in a referendum without wanting a success, and I think they were very. I think there was a kind of a smugness around it. When we were on the ground, we had teams canvassing in 30 different locations over the course of the kind of 6 weeks run up. And one of the big takeaways was that we had to do the state's work for them. We had to explain the proposition and then explain why they should vote against it, firstly. And secondly, if you're going to change the status quo, you better bloody make a compelling argument. And they didn't. But not only that, they insulted the intelligence of the Irish people and the hunger for rigor, I think, when it comes to public discourse. And particularly as well, they insulted really, I think, Bunreacht na hÉireann, because I think people do hold it in such high regard. I think largely as well because of our history of colonialism. There's a sense of pride in it. And I felt personally it was a really narcissistic assault on our foundational legal text. That's how I felt about it in terms of the project. But in terms of, the arguments that we ran, yeah, I think that their side were running kind of vapid slogans like equality, family, care. Then they were telling outright lies, which we now know we have evidence for. But like they were, there was two types of lies. There were the lies which were just completely untrue in law and in fact. So things like, and I think it's pretty unforgivable to tell single moms who are, incredibly vulnerable quite often, to tell them that up until now, you've actually not been equal in law. You don't have the same rights in law. You don't have equality under the Constitution as people who have married. I mean, that's simply not true. It's absolutely not true. It's categorically not true based on case law going back decades. It's not even particularly new case law. It's not new jurisprudence. And then telling carers that this was going to help them deliver some kind of platform for greater provision. I mean, it's just absolute nonsense. It's also outright lies, really. I'm just going to call it what it is. It is lies. A government obviously can pass legislation at any time to provide for anything they want. I would say that there is court policy often around public purse strings, which is probably why 41.2 was not fully actualised in terms of, let's say, for example, a universal wage for stay-at-home mums. For instance, if you could envisage it coming to its full actualisation as a concept. But that doesn't really matter, because what people understood by the end, through our advocacy and others like us in the fight, like Maria Steen was incredible, and Nuala Nufuelon, we did a very early march and rally with. She was incredible. Obviously, MacDougall was out on the airwaves every single day, practically, at least every day, explaining the legal framework. And I think it really worked very well, actually, in terms of different voices. But I think by the end, our core argument percolated up to the top, which was that 41.2 does bestow constitutional rights and protections to mothers in Ireland. And not only that, when you actually read it in the whole, yes, of course, it's a bit old-fashioned and annoying when it talks about duties, neglecting duties. But overall, it's quite a radical provision, because it's basically saying, I can't think, as a woman, as a feminist, I cannot think of anywhere I've ever read in an official document that the state recognises what women and mothers are doing in the home and how that feeds into and contributes to the common good. I've never seen that said to me. I've never seen it set down. And I think when people started grappling with the reality rather than, oh, it's women in the home, all the kind of vapid slogans and mistruths, when they dug down and when they listened to us and the arguments, they actually went, no bloody way. I don't want to, well, a few things. I don't want to conflate mothering with care. And I don't want to delete the word mother from the Constitution, or woman, but also, woman is elsewhere. But also they realised when they read it that it was a beautiful recognition of what's often, thankless and invisible labour in the home. And I think largely as well, they understood that, none of this was going to change the lives of women at all, or the lives of carers. And 98% of that unpaid care of disabled people is done by women, as it was, I'm sure, in 1937 when Bunreacht na hÉireann was drafted. So really, I think that they weren't fooled. I think they just weren't fooled. I think that's what happened. And I'm really, really proud of the result. And I do think there's a mandate there. 1.1 million people is a huge amount of people to emphatically reject what was a very kind of empty, lazy and incoherent attempt to kind of, I don't know, Jerry, have another party in Dublin Castle. I was there till the very end, along with the other disability group, Equality for Disability, and that was it. Everyone just sidled off home. Not a single politician was there for the second amendment result, which I think is shall I say, churlish at the very least, isn't it?
Yeah, and I suppose bringing it up to your event at the weekend, and we've had a bit of back and forth on the phone and text. You've been encountering kind of protests to what you're, despite the 1.1 million and their voices, if you like, you're still facing a lot of kind of resistance to even. I've looked at some of the names on on your schedule. They're by no means, I wouldn't consider any of them radical. What have you faced, and how are you dealing with it in terms of
well, just
protesters?
in purely in a material sense, it's obviously, as you know yourself, having organized a festival. I mean, there's just like 1,000 jobs to do, and only a handful of people to do them. But then also you can get derailed from the kind of countdown, which has happened to us, unfortunately, whereby you lose 5 days or 6 days dealing with, drama. And unfortunately, in this game, people often feel the need to go public with things, and that's unfortunate because it's very damaging, because it's only ever one point of view. So, I mean, my way of approaching disagreement in this space, this activism space, is to never ever go public about anything, because I just think I respect the movement too much. And quite often it is literally just your subjective opinion about something, and you feel triggered by something because of your own personal life, lived experience, political beliefs, whatever that may be. So there's that rumbling on, which has kind of really always been there. Sometimes people on the same side as you are even harder to deal with than sort of the other side in a debate like this. There's a lot of purism. There's a lot of kind of judging, and it's much easier to throw stones from the outside and heckle from the cheap seats than it is to actually build something of this nature. And like, obviously it's a statement. I mean, it is a statement. I mean, I chose the RDS because it's an incredible building. It's in the heart of, Bowles Bridge. It's where the horse show happens. Like, it's just has that kind of auspicious vibe. And the statement is that we are not ashamed, and we're not hiding, and we there's nothing extreme about the position that we hold. In fact, it's the position of 9 out of 10 people in Ireland, and I'll never be persuaded otherwise. And so it's about kind of bringing that message mainstream, and making that statement. And then also, so there is a planned protest. Not totally shocked by that. I would have expected that. I don't know how big it's going to be. We had an event in Carlow, and they said they were going to protest, and they never showed up, but we had to get for security. So with the RDS as well, we have a huge number of security on kind of on all the exits and entrances, and Garda Síochána, we're engaging with them as well in terms of the public side of things on the road, and where the protests will be. And all I can say is that we're going to do, we absolutely will do our utmost, and it's a very serious matter, kind of in terms of risk assessments and all the rest. But all that is all in train. It's nothing has been left up to chance. That's the nature of risk assessments, isn't it? Kind of you look at the worst case scenario. Mm-hmm. But I feel like it's really important not to let the bullies win. And I think as well, absolutely, you create this kind of rancor in society when you're challenging the orthodoxy, the status quo, because there's lots of vested interest in keeping that going. But we can't wait for the day. We just can't wait to get to the finishing point. It feels like we're in a video game and we're ducking and diving and being attacked from every side. But when we get there, like, we'll have earned it, and so will everyone else who's at that conference. So I'm just asking people to buy tickets, please. We're not going to make any money from this. If anything, we'll make a loss. But it's an important milestone, in this campaign, in this movement. I think in light of the Cass review, and after the referendum, there's just no going back. The establishment has to grasp the nettle, really, and the nettle is the conflict of rights. We're not anti-trans. We want trans-identified people to be free of all harassment when they walk down the street, to not have their employment rights or housing or anything impacted by their identities. If a man wants to wear makeup and a dress, more power to him. That doesn't mean that I should allow that man into my daughter's changing room. That is the crux of the matter. And that's what we have to have a conversation about, that is respectful and open. And that's what we've always facilitated in the Countess. And, and we're not just razzmatazz, like we do the hard labor. Like we probably do a submission a month, we're just endlessly pumping out the brain work as well. You've seen some of it yourself. You were in Buzzwells that day. But I mean, that would be the case with all of our different areas. But you asked me actually about the bill, was there much mainstream support? And it's funny, actually, one thing I did notice, which I was heartened by, was that, we lobbied all summer to get people to sign that so it could get to first stage and then second stage. And now we're lobbying for a group of TDs to give us their private minutes so that they can force the debate and have a second stage debate. And that's the second stage of lobbying. But the first stage of lobbying was just to get people to sign it, literally. We wanted to get 10 signatures. And one of those signatures is Willie O'D. And, I was really glad to see him being interviewed by Ben Scallon. And he was like boasting about signing it, He said, well, there's a bill in Parliament. He goes, he didn't mention me or the Countess, but I didn't care. I was delighted because he said,
"Oh, that'd be Willie O'D anyway."
He goes, into bill. I've signed that bill, just like trying to get it in there. And I was like, oh, that's a good sign, because it means like people are now, well, not people, but he's Fianna Fáil, and obviously he doesn't care about the whip. Clearly, he's just he's one of the kind of rogues, one of the rebels. I think we need to see more of those rebels, really, don't we?
Well, Willie O'D's a curious character. Like, he's a bellwether. When Willie O'D speaks on, will say something like that, or even going back to the end of the COVID era, when the game was up, Willie O'D is one of those Fianna Fáil guys that says out kind of, it's almost, he's the guy, he's the designated guy that comes out and says, enough is enough kind of thing. But just before we move on, I just want to say to anyone that's on the live stream, if you could share this video, and also there's links to the ticket site for Saturday's event in the description of this video. So I'd encourage everybody that can go to the event to purchase a ticket. I think they're very reasonably priced, and they're definitely, from the price I've seen, they definitely won't be making any money from the event. So just that bit. I suppose we should touch on the thing, and for kind of people that are just coming to this debate afresh. What is trans? How do you describe it, or how, in a nutshell?
Well, trans is perceived by some still to this day as a type of sexual orientation, like being gay, straight, or bisexual, but it's not at all anything like that. I mean, that was a very clever campaign advocacy sleight of hand, really, to make people think it was like that. In fact, there's always been a population that was that suffered from gender dysphoria, or cross-sex ideation, you could call it. I think language is really important here. So when someone says to me, trans people exist, I will say, well, people with diagnosis of gender dysphoria exist, for sure. But, this is about accepting the premise or not. Like, I'm not sure I accept the premise that there's such a thing. Like, what does a trans person mean? Let's dig into that. Let's drill into that. So it's not like being gay, straight, or bisexual. And depending on your age group, there are different types of people in this umbrella called trans. And if you look at the TENI website, they will say that men who cross-dress for sexual pleasure are included in this website, in this umbrella. And so they would be what we used to call in the olden days transvestites. It would also include what we used to call in the olden days transsexuals. And often they were gay men who wanted to pass as female and would have full surgery. And in current modern times, they would be often, when they talk about how vulnerable transgender people are, what they actually are doing is conflating the statistics which pertain to prostituted men in sort of central middle America, or the ghettos of America, who lead very dangerous lives, but as in the same manner that a prostituted woman would. A prostituted woman is 7 times more likely to be murdered than a non-prostituted woman. So it's just a dangerous life to be in. But in terms of the statistics that attach to trans people in Europe, they are the safest population by far. There's never been a recorded killing of a trans-identified person ever in the history of the state. So it's, if you're talking about the population of young girls, and that's seen like a astronomical hike in numbers. You're talking about between 4,000 and 5,000% in rates of cross-sex ideation. And I don't think it's any coincidence that has happened exactly at the moment that the iPhone came onto the scene. You know, there's a huge element of social contagion, and there's a huge element of this is how teenage girls transmit their collective psychic distress, because teenage girls have always done that in one way or another, whether it was hysteria or fainting or cutting or purging. This is what they do, and this is what they're doing now. So I think that population would have nothing in common really with the middle-aged male population. And I think the cast review really shows that these girls really need therapeutic help, and they don't need puberty blockers. A huge preponderance of autism spectrum is there in that population, and also the vast majority will turn out to be gay. So as I said earlier, like these young people, if let go through their normal puberty, will just be gays or lesbians or bisexuals. And so we should support that as a society rather than transing them.
No, and that's that. In fact, I think that's how I came on to looking into the whole area. It was through talking to a young woman in her 20s who was a lesbian who had gone through one of the, we'll say, NGO organizations in Ireland, and it was this concept of kind of it seemed like an attack on, again, women, and in the form of being asked to entertain relationships with biological men, in a sense, who are identifying as a kind of lesbian.
Yeah. I mean, that was actually my entry point into this. There was a protest at Gay Pride in 2018 in London, and it was lesbians who held up signs saying the cotton ceilings rape culture, and they were saying that basically they were under pressure to accept the penis, and that is like, that's coercion, really. How different is that from corrective rape in African countries where that takes place? And then also, it's really a pincer gripped movement really around lesbians, because younger lesbians are being told by the ideology they're not lesbians, they are trans men.
You have, I think, one of the speakers at your event is somebody who's now detransitioned, and I'm not sure if that is the correct terminology, who's gone through we'll say, the medical side of it.
We're going to have the mother of a de-sister in Ireland talking about kind of how they were able to get their child off the pathway, and we're hoping to speak to an Irish detransitioner as well. It's unfortunate that people who detransition, having been on opposite sex hormones, really deal with a lifetime of pain and chronic pain, and it's not a happy ending, you know.
No, well, it doesn't seem to be from any of the, any of the research, if you'd call it research, that I've seen on it. Anyway, the percentages seem to be, over time, high, who are sorry for going through the process. I suppose,
Leisha, even a longitudinal study in Sweden that shows that actually, even for adults, there is a sort of honeymoon period after full medical transition, but after that, the mental health issues that were there prior to transition are as bad, if not worse. So I think this is a huge issue that's starting to kind of finally be faced, really, you know. And there's a lot of reverse ferreting going on, I've noticed, around the place.
How serious a problem is it in this country with regard to kids being put on the path of puberty blockers, and that, the kind of medicalization and, we'll say, drug pathways that you can be put on when you do kind of self-identify as trans?
So since essentially there was a satellite clinic here, and there was also the children were also sent over to the TAVI. And so in terms of the data, you're talking about 234 children who've been treated under that protocol, which is now deemed completely unsafe. And I think it really behoves the Minister for Children to tell us what is the plan for those children. Or the Minister for Health, indeed. I think there should be a joint statement by now. Whose care are they in? What's the follow-up? I think the people have had really enough of this kind of putting fingers in their ears and closing their eyes. Nothing to see here. The health of children is at stake.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well said. Just one thing on the self-ID, Leisha, just to dive into that, because am I correct in saying that since the Gender Recognition Act, I can self-ID with basically no medical or psychiatric intervention, and if I wanted to change my birth certificate to a different gender, I could do that. Am I correct in saying that?
Yeah, so the Foy case was the test case in Ireland, Lydia Foy. And initially, at first instance, he failed in his application to have his birth cert changed. And McKechnie J says, it's a beautiful judgment, because, especially for an activist, because what he says is a birth cert is not a document of one's travels through life. Unlike, say, a passport or whatever. He also says that it's in the interest of the state to keep correct birth records. And he further goes on to say about his concerns that this will impact the rights of women and children. So he really saw into the future, but unfortunately, then what happened was we had the Goodwin case at European level, and then that meant that there was a case stated. So it went back basically to the High Court for another decision. And in that case, Foy won. But what people don't understand is, and there's a real narrative around, the battle for trans rights has been 20 years, and it was fought by Lydia Foy. Firstly, Lydia Foy had full surgery. Secondly, it was fought on two heads: right to privacy, right to marry. Right to marry is moot once we bring in gay marriage. Right to privacy pertained to his marker, his biological marker on specific documents like PRSI and things like this. It was never once discussed if he could enter female spaces. That was never mentioned. It wasn't mentioned in either of those cases, Goodwin or Foy. But we brought in, legislation was brought in, and the legislation reads "for all purposes," which means that basically use the GRC to enter any female space. And so I call it a purpose, an all-purpose pass, really, an all access, and all areas access pass, really, and clearly it can be misused by like sports cheats or chancers or predators. I mean, why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they use it? Why wouldn't you? If you were on remand for rape, why wouldn't you fill out a form to avoid Mount Joy and to go to the women's wing?
And there's plenty of evidence, specifically from the UK, that is what is happening.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's indisputable now in terms of the data that there's a direct correlation with trans-identified male prisoners and rates of sexual offending. So either you're more likely to be a sex offender if you're trans-identified, or trans-identified males are using this, to act like predators, sexual predators are using this loophole to avoid male prison and go to female prison. It's one or the other. It has to be one or the other.
Yeah. We're actually. I'm conscious of your time, and you have kindly given us lots of it. I suppose. Do you want to give us just a final summary of the event on Saturday, and basically what people can do to support the Countess, not just obviously with the event, go buy a ticket if you're watching this and are in the region, but what generally can people do to kind of support the work of the Countess?
So we have an amazing team. We work really, really hard, and some of us have been working like 18-hour days, and we went straight from the referendum, segued straight into this. And we really do need financial support at this stage, because we're hand to mouth. We don't get any funding. We've no big donors. We're not an NGO. We get nothing from government. And we just rattle a can from time to time. So we have opened GoFundMe, that's going to be emptied soon. And also we are asking people if they want to become friends of the Countess, which is for between 2,000 and 5,000. You will gain VIP access. You'll go backstage, and you can gain access to our paywall material, and just it's really for people who can really see the value of what we're doing, because we're trying to move the country in the right direction, and we are proven to be able to move the dial just as a group of volunteers. So I mean, that's what I would ask people to consider. And in terms of the lineup on the day, I mean, it's going to be incredible. Like, we're going to deliver the proposition, which is really to explore and understand, but then also unite and resist. We don't see this as a left or right issue. And we see there's lots of different methods and approaches, and some might be messy and some might be more considered, but we feel there's room for everyone, and that's what we're trying to bring out of this conference.
Okay, great stuff, Laoise. Thanks again for your time. And finally, just to the people watching, the event is just get this correct, Resisting Ideology. It's from 9:30 to 6:30, Laoise, on Saturday in the RDS
it's actually,
Concert Hall.
No, 12:30. Half 12. Doors open at 12 and it starts at 12:30.
Okay, so doors open at 12, starts at 12:30.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you can get the tickets on Ticketmaster, I think, and they're in the description here or on the Countess website. So thanks, Laoise. And
one thing I forgot to say, Jerry, is our headline act, our kind of key